Thank you for coming to Holocaust Remembrance Week here at Ocean County College. I'm Dr. Ali Botin-Furvig. I'm the director of the OCC Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education. And the theme of our annual memorial is Jewish resistance during World War II. One of the things that I get asked when I discuss the history of and the atrocities during the Holocaust with succeeding generations like yourselves is, why didn't the Jews resist? Why didn't they fight back sooner? Why didn't they fight back more often? And I think the best answer can be found in a quote by Elie Wiesel, humanitarian, Holocaust survivor, author of over 50 books. He suggested reframing this question. He explains, quote, "The question isn't why all the Jews did not fight, but how did so many of them? Tormented, beaten, starved, where did they find the strength, spiritual and physical, to resist?" I just wanted to draw your attention to a map of all of the countries in Europe that were occupied by Germany during World War II, just as sort of as a background and give you some context. It's pretty widespread. So the first thing I suppose we should talk about is what Jewish resistance is, and that is Mr. Wiesel. It's, according to the Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer, who wrote wonderful books, many of which are used as texts, he defines Jewish resistance as any undertaking to frustrate the Germans' efforts to tormenting or killing the Jewish people. And it doesn't always have to involve guns and bullets. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand is that what was essential to the Nazis' nightmarish vision to eradicate all of the Jewish people was the forced evacuation of Jewish people from their homes throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. They were living in shtetls, those are little towns or villages scattered across Europe. And on September 21st in 1939, which was the date actually World War II began when Germany invaded Poland, Reinhard Heydrich issued an order stating that in Poland, initially, Jews were to be concentrated in large towns and cities near railway lines whose proximity to transportation would facilitate the eventual transport of, and I hate this term, human cargo from the ghetto to death camps with the greatest efficiency. And so what the Nazis did was they built brick and mortar walls and wire around these ghettos, and they reinforced them with emplacements, attack dogs, very tightly guarded checkpoints. The Nazis also introduced ghettos using their false theories that Jews spread disease and therefore should be segregated to protect the rest of the population. And that was, not surprisingly, right in line with their racist and eugenic beliefs. Now, in the ghetto, that's a song by Elvis, actually. In the ghetto, living conditions were unimaginably horrible. For example, the Warsaw Ghetto, the overcrowding, coupled with a lack of clean running water and proper sewage systems, resulted in poor sanitation and rampant disease. Radios, telephones, telegraph communications were verboten, forbidden, upon penalty of death. Publishing newsletters, illegal. Prisoners were forced to wear a yellow Star of David, Mogen David, and medical supplies were sparse. And after the ghettos were sealed and really cut off from the outside world, all of those things ran out altogether. And we have here a picture of them building a wall for the Warsaw Ghetto, and below is the Lodz Ghetto. So to understand this whole question about why didn't the Jewish people fight back sooner, there were a lot of obstacles to resistance in this case. Understandably, initial Jewish response was to comply with the German demands and orders, hoping that that would prevent them from making things even worse. And I think we can all sympathize with that thought. But there are those who blame the Jewish people for their own fate instead of creating empathy, having empathy with their plight, and also respecting the dignity and the strength of the victims and the survivors. I mean, after all, who would believe that an advanced Western nation, such as Germany, highly cultured, highly civilized, could plan and implement the brutal murder of millions of men, women, and children? Germany was the birthplace of the likes of Beethoven, Mozart, Heinrich Heine, Schopenhauer, and other musicians and philosophers and scholars. But one of the biggest obstacles was the superior armed power of the German military. They had it all. There was also this German idea of collective responsibility, which means that the Germans vowed to hold entire families and communities responsible for any individual acts of resistance. So one example is the Czech fighters who actually assassinated the aforementioned Richard Heydrich in 1942. The Nazis retaliated by razing the Bohemian town of Ladice and its 700 residents who had absolutely nothing to do with the assassination. And they did send the residents to concentration camps. The other thing was the secrecy and deception about deportations. The Jews did not and could not have anticipated early on their fate. They didn't even know where they were being sent. The Nazis went as far as forcing new arrivals at Auschwitz and other killing centers to write postcards back home to relatives prior to being gassed with the words, "Arrived safely, I'm doing well." So the question is, well, how did the Jews finally learn about the massacres that were happening in distant places and the gassings and the death camps? After all, they were in these ghettos with little or no access to newspapers or radio broadcasts. But they did hear stories, they did hear rumors, oftentimes based on reports from a few Jews who managed to escape from deportation trains, shooting sites, and even killing centers. That in itself is quite remarkable. Often they'd send couriers to other ghettos to find out if these rumors were in fact true and to report on their own community events. Now the couriers, many of whom were women, were more than messengers who carried letters from one city to another. They smuggled documents, underground newspapers, and even weapons into the sealed ghettos of Poland. There was also the absence of a non-Jewish population that were willing to harbor or assist escapees. It wasn't that they were cheerleaders for the Gestapo. It was, again, there were severe penalties to be paid if you were caught helping. And there are, as you know, many non-Jews, Christians who are referred to as the righteous among nations, who helped so many Jewish people to survive. Okay. The other thing is that the Nazi propaganda machine disguised this genocidal policy as, oh, we're just moving them to a safer place. Okay. Yes, propaganda played a big role in their effectiveness in making all of this happen, kind of promoting this awful image of Jewish people as vermin, as less than human, dehumanizing, which is one of the steps in any genocide. Let's talk about the different types of resistance: armed, unarmed. Armed resistance involved espionage, sabotaging the Nazi war effort by bombing strategic military places, targets, blowing up supply trains, things of that nature, uprisings in the ghettos and extermination camps, and partisan fighters, guerrilla fighters. Some of the people who escaped from the ghettos, or they escaped from trains or concentration camps, fled to the forests where they would join underground movements called the partisan fighters. They were guerrilla fighters, and they used speed and surprise and mobility and tremendous knowledge of the area to attack Germans and then escape. They blew up thousands of supply trains, convoys, bridges. They sabotaged or destroyed power plants, factories, and other targets. They conducted rescue missions. They formed in more than 100 ghettos all over Europe and later in camps. And basically, they were young people, young men, young women, maybe teenagers, and they were both Jewish refugees and nationals, but they shared the same goal of defeating the Nazi invaders. Jews and non-Jews fought as equals, and sometimes Jewish people formed their own partisan groups. One of the most unique and largest and well-known partisan groups was the Bielski Brigade, which lived in the deep, dense forest in Belarus. It was started by one of the Bielski brothers. There were actually 5. 2 were killed by the Nazis, but the remaining 3, they weren't about revenge. They were just about saving other Jews. And they grew to a total of over 1,200. They engaged in armed combat, yes, but its primary mission was to provide some type of a safe haven for civilians who escaped. And the whole forest experience was a small community living in the forest, complete with a synagogue, in the case of Bielski, complete with a synagogue, a law court, workshops, schools, and a medical dispensary. Approximately 10% of some 30,000 Jewish partisans were women. Some performed traditional roles. They cared for the sick, the wounded, they cooked and fed the troops. And those who had an Aryan look about them, which was blue eyes, blonde hair, acted as couriers, decoys, and smugglers. Unarmed. Unarmed included the smuggling of food, clothing, and weapons, forging identity documents, distributing literature that was anti-Nazi, assisting in these rescue missions, listening to Allied broadcasts, having clandestine prayer meetings, having underground schools and libraries. It was very important to the Jewish people to teach their children prayers, songs, holidays, traditions, and customs, and documenting the atrocities of the Holocaust so that today we can see that the Holocaust did in fact happen. And it can be documentation by writing in a diary, as Anne Frank did. It can be artwork from the children of terrors in camp who recorded their terrors, their fears, and yet their hopes and their dreams. And again, maintaining spiritual and cultural traditions, knowing full well what discovery would mean. So let's take a little world tour here. We're going to go to Germany. Jewish resistance in Germany itself during the Nazi era took a variety of forms, including sabotage and disruptions to providing intelligence to the Allied forces. They distributed anti-Nazi literature. They participated in well thought out and executed attempts to assist Jewish emigration out of Nazi-controlled territories. It's been argued that for Jews during the Holocaust, given the intent of the regime to exterminate Jews, that survival itself constituted an act considered a form of resistance. Austrian Jews and German Jews were members of non-Jewish political groups that opposed the Nazis, such as the Communist and Social Democratic parties. And sometimes, because of that, their actions haven't been regarded specifically as Jewish resistance. But Jewish resistance in Germany was confined to a lot of underground activities of left-wing Zionist groups. Zionist refers to Israel, a love of Israel, a support of Israel, wanting to emigrate to Israel, which some of them did. And some of those groups were Hashoma, Hatzer, and Habomim. Okay. The picture of the dancing, jazz was totally forbidden by Hitler. It was modern. It was anti-everything Aryan stood for, and yet you had young people dancing to jazz, which they saw was being done at that time in the United States. The artist Leah Grundig produced anti-fascist art, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. She painted on the roof of a cinema, which Jews were not allowed to attend, Nieder mit Hitler, down with Hitler. There was also an anti-fascist resistance group of Jewish girls, led by one Eva Mamluk, who clandestinely worked in Berlin distributing anti-war propaganda. It wasn't propaganda, actually, it was the truth. Helmut Hirsch. Helmut Hirsch was a German Jew who was part of a plot to destabilize Nazi Germany by bombing Nazi Party headquarters, and that particular building was the printing plant for the magazine Der Stürmer, which was a terribly anti-Semitic publication. After the passage of the Nuremberg laws in Germany, Mr. Hirsch became very involved in the Black Front, which was an anti-Nazi organization of German expats. He was eventually betrayed by a double agent. But perhaps the most significant Jewish resistance group in Germany was the Berlin-based Baumgruppe, or Baumgruppe. It was made up of young Jewish men and women who had Zionist and communist sympathies. They disseminated leaflets. They organized semi-public demonstrations, but its most notable event was setting fire to the Nazi anti-Soviet exhibit, Soviet Paradise, in Berlin, which was organized by Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda, and which sought to ridicule communism and identifying Jews with the Soviet system. And that action resulted in mass arrests, executions, and reprisals against German Jews. Yeah, they were called the Swing Kids. I just looked at that. Okay. So Germany was doing its part. Okay, resistance in France. During the interwar period between World War I and World War II, France was one of the more liberal countries. They welcomed Jewish immigrants, many of them from Eastern Europe. After World War I, thousands of Jews viewed France as a European land of equality and opportunity, and they helped to make its capital, Paris, a thriving center of Jewish culture. In May of 1940, when France was invaded by German forces, the French colonial empire remained under the authority of Marshal Pétain, whose picture is in the bottom right. It was called the Vichy regime because it was located in Vichy. But France was roughly divided into an occupied northern zone and an unoccupied southern zone. Pétain willfully collaborated with Nazi Germany and signed more anti-Semitic legislation than even his masters required of him. The French police, under Pétain, conducted raids to capture Jews and other undesirables. Families were crowded at one point. I'm not sure of the year. I just was reading a book about this, about resistance in France, into the Velodrome d'Hiver, which was a sports arena in Paris, and they suffered without food or water or sanitary conditions before being shipped off or trained off to Auschwitz. Now, Charles de Gaulle, that should be a name you're familiar with, he was a colonel in the French army, and he openly refused to swear allegiance to the Vichy regime. He advocated to the people open resistance, committing acts of sabotage and assaults on German officials. So France had many all-Jewish partisan units. The Armée Juive, meaning the Jewish army, attacked German military trucks and trains. They carried out missions of sabotage. And the Jews fighting in these units were inspired to resist, I can't think of a better way to put it, than just by their Jewish heritage. Okay? In 1944, a consolidated Jewish partisan force known as the Organisation Juive de Combat, Jewish Fighting Organization, captured a German train loaded with soldiers and food and weapons and ammunition. And the partisans, all wearing Star of David armbands, triumphantly informed the terrified German prisoners, Ich bin Jude, meaning I am a Jew. Now, women. Despite the fact that women didn't hold a high status, particularly in pre-war French society, they did play a disproportionately large role in the French resistance against the Nazis. Hundreds of women protected their fellow Jews, especially Jewish children, from the Nazis. We have Margot Kohn, Marianne Kohn, Madeleine Dreyfus, Denise Gamzon, Ariane Knaut, and Mila Racine, André Salomon, and Juliette Stern, and each of them heroically saved Jewish lives. Also, I just want to mention Marcel Marceau, because Marcel Marceau is a famous mime. Okay, I think you'll recognize him from the picture. He was recruited by a resistance group to help save Jewish children and to smuggle them from occupied France to neutral countries. And the children felt very safe with him. He just had a way with them. He gave them comfort, he kept them quiet, and he posed as a Boy Scout troop as they went through the countryside to safety. He just had remarkable skills, and I can't imagine doing a presentation on resistance without referring to Marcel Marceau, who said, "What is important are our deeds during our lifetime." Okay. At the age of 80, I don't believe I have her picture here. I might have it somewhere else. At the age of 80, Martha Hoffnung Kohn was awarded the very prestigious Medal Militaire for her service as an intelligence officer in the French army during the war. She was a very fair-haired Jew who was very fluent in German, so she easily was able to become a spy who at the age of 24 made many trips behind enemy lines to return with information that was critical to the Allies. Okay. Resistance in Poland. Resistance units emerged in about 100 ghettos in Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Jews resisted first when the Germans attempted to establish ghettos in a number of small towns in eastern Poland. And revolts took place in Kletsk, Glakva, Mir, Tushin, and other towns. And as the Germans liquidated the major ghettos a year later in 1943, they met with Jewish armed resistance in Krakow, Bialystok, and Tarnow. But thousands of Jews escaped the ghettos and joined partisan groups. There was, I can't overlook it, there was a history of Polish anti-Semitism, but numerous Polish partisan groups welcomed the Jews because, again, they had a common goal. So hundreds of Jewish partisans belonged to, and a lot took leadership roles in, the People's Guard and the Home Army and other groups. So thousands fought back, and many lost their lives. Many didn't expect to survive, as reflected in the motto of one of the Jewish partisan groups, which was, "For those who seek life, we're not the address." Then, this is one of my favorite stories. There was a 24-year-old young woman named Nyuta Teitelbaum, who in 1943, she was blonde, blue eyes. She looks like she's a brunette, but she wasn't. She strolled into a Gestapo apartment in central Warsaw and faced 3 Nazis. She was dressed in her characteristic disguise as a Polish farm girl with a kerchief, and she had braided her long hair, and she blushed and she smiled very meekly, and then she pulled out a gun and shot them all. Now, 2 were killed, 1 was wounded and sent to the hospital. Nyuta, our girl Nyuta, she wasn't satisfied. She found a physician's coat. She entered the hospital where the injured man was being treated and killed the Nazi and the police officer who was guiding him. She was known as Little Wanda with the braids. Perhaps the most famous form of resistance happened in 1943, in April of 1943, when the Jews of Warsaw, outgunned and outnumbered, and launched the largest ghetto uprising. For almost a month, the Germans suppressed the uprising. Jews fought the Germans both in the ghettos and behind the front lines in nearby forests. Prisoner revolts also took place in many of the Nazi killing centers, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. In Auschwitz in 1944, one of the 4 crematorium was blown up, and this was the work of the workers, mostly Jews, whose job it was to clear away the dead bodies of the gas chamber victims. The workers were all captured and killed. Okay, Dutch resistance in Holland, the Netherlands. So the Germans invaded Holland or the Netherlands in 1940, and the Dutch were particularly outraged that their country had been invaded, and they were horrified at the restrictive policies towards the Jewish people, who numbered at that time 140,000. Holland prided itself on its very liberal democratic traditions and respect for the law, and the Jews considered themselves, citizens of Holland. The Dutch resistance was basically providing allies with intelligence information. And in solidarity with their Jewish brethren, many of the Dutch non-Jews wore a Star of David, the yellow Star of David. Within the underground Communist Party, a militant group was formed there called the Dutch People's Militia with about 200 Jewish participants. They made several attacks, bomb attacks on German troop trains and arson attacks on cinemas, which were forbidden for Jews, the cinemas, that is. They also helped Dutch Jews to escape, especially the children. There were 9 organizations that were created to do this. They specialized in hiding people, in forging papers, and in the spring of 1942, the Germans ordered, as I said, all Dutch Jews to affix a yellow star, and the Christians put one as well to protest. Among the first of the Jewish resistors was a German fugitive named Ernst Kahn. Ernst Kahn owned an ice cream parlor. This is another terrific story. And he and his partner had an ammonia gas cylinder installed in the ice cream parlor in case there was an attack, in case the Nazis, came in. Well, lo and behold, one day in February, the German police forced their entrance into the parlor and were all gassed. This is a lovely story of 2 sisters, Johnny and Leon Brilleschleiper. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They were 2 sisters. They were both young mothers in their early 20s, and risking arrest and death, the sisters helped to save dozens of lives by sheltering Jews in a safe house in the woods that became known as the High Nest. From all over the country, the 2 sisters took in desperate Jews. The house was initially inhabited by a core group of 17 adults and children, which grew to more than 20 and 30 at times. It became known in the underground that the High Nest was a safe haven in the forest where a lot of artists and resistance fighters, as well as their families, hid. They printed resistance paper, they printed forged documents, I'm sorry. They had opera nights, how about that? They had Yiddish classes. Yiddish culture flourished at a time when 75% of the Dutch Jewish population was systematically being murdered. Eventually, the occupants of that house were betrayed. The sisters were sent off on, I think it was the last train to Auschwitz, along with Anne Frank and her family. And the journey brought the 2 sisters very close to Anne and her older sister, Margot. The sisters, these 2, they survived. Obviously, the Frank sisters did not. Then there was Benny Bloom. Benny was a boxer, and he organized Jewish fighting parties consisting of members of his boxing school. And as mentioned a moment ago, the most well-known Dutch victims were Otto Frank and his family, who hid in an attic with the Van Pels family. For many individuals today, Anne Frank's diary represents their only glimpse of the Nazi assault in the Netherlands. And that's a very narrow window onto which the Holocaust was like in Europe. But her diary is something much more, I think. It's not just, it's about the tragic death of a young girl, but it also demonstrates, I think, the ability of the human spirit to resist oppression under the most severe, horrendous circumstances. She had a lust for life, a love of life. She appreciated nature. She had hopes for her future. And she filled her diary with all of this until the day she was captured. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Miss Audrey Hepburn, famous actress, Breakfast at Tiffany's, among other films. And she was slightly older than Anne at the time, but she made a difference. She, at the time, was a ballerina. and she worked for the resistance. What she did was she gave illegal musical performances at various by invitation only locations, and the point was to raise funds to shelter the tens of thousands of Jews and other people hiding across the Netherlands. So I think we have to give a shout out to Miss Audrey Hepburn. Okay. Italy. Italy. Jews had lived in Italy for over 2,000 years and had one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. In 1938, the government under Benito Mussolini began to legislate and enforce anti-Semitic legislation, very similar to the Nuremberg laws in Germany, and that included removing Jews from government and teaching jobs, banning marriage between Jews and non-Jews, dismissing Jews from the armed forces, taking away Jewish citizenship in the country they were born in. In 1943, German troops rounded up Jews in major cities throughout northern Italy. Everywhere there were Italian partisans active, Jewish partisans were among them. As many as 2,000 partisans fought in Italian groups out of a total of 35,000 in German-occupied Italy. Italy had very little anti-Semitism, and the Italian Jews thought of themselves as Italians, as Jews in other countries. They thought of themselves, yes, as Jews, but also as the place of birth. So, I'm Polish, I'm whatever I am. Okay, so Italian Jews fought along their fellow Italians in totally integrated groups, most citing their patriotism rather than their Jewishness. And they were on equal terms with their self-defense. There were some Jews in Italian partisan groups who were new arrivals to Italy, having fled Nazi-occupied countries, thinking Italy's safe. Okay. Eugenio Callo, he's up there in the bottom. He was the owner of a machine shop, and he joined a partisan group to avenge the killing of his wife and children who were killed in Auschwitz. He was a Sephardic Jew. Most of the Jews that were killed during the Holocaust were Ashkenaz of German ancestry. And he was a commander of a brigade operation in the mountains of Tuscany. And in July 1944, they captured 30 German soldiers. But even though the Nazis had killed his family, his children, Kalo refused to execute them on the spot and turn them over to the Allies. Then there was, who was there? Eugenio Colorni, a professor of philosophy in Milan. He became the leader of another resistance group. Rita Rossani was a teacher in a Jewish school in Trieste. She was 24 when she was killed while fighting. And an Italian military gold medal was awarded to her posthumously, the only woman to have received one. Let's continue our global tour here. Hungary. At the beginning of World War II, about 750,000 Jews lived in Hungary, half in Budapest, the capital. They initially joined the war on the side of Germany to protect its territory, and the Hungarian government urged the Hungarian government urged Hungary to deport the Jews, but nobody wanted to comply. And why? Because most of the Jews in Hungary were members of the mobility. They directed major industries, they had international trading and banking connections. And so when Hungary broke its alliance with Germany in 1944, Germany suddenly invaded and rounded up Jews and deported them to death camps. The only resistance in Hungary came from two sources. One was a small Zionist party who with Jewish refugees who had escaped deportations, who were Zionists again, and were helping as many Jews as they could find their way to Israel. They operated, again, small printing presses to forge birth certificates, baptismal certificates, ration cards even, and other documents. Shagra Wheel is, I think he's still alive. Shagra Wheel is living in Israel, I think. Well, he moved to Israel. And he's a very famous Israeli painter. And he was foremost among the document forgers. Who else do we have? We have Swiss diplomat Charles Lutz. This is an interesting story. He saved half of Budapest's Jewish population. He used paper, not weapons, official Swiss protection to safe houses throughout Budapest. As thousands of Jews were forced to walk to various concentration camps, march there in Austria and Germany, Lutz and his wife pulled as many as they could from this very grim march and issued them protective documents. Dr. Rezno Kastler, can't leave him out. He was a Zionist leader in Budapest. He helped to found the Relief and Rescue Committee of Budapest. His is an incredible story. They were very successful in smuggling refugees from Poland and Slovakia into Hungary. But he decided, Dr. Kastner did, that the best way to save Hungarian Jewry, which was the last Jewish community in Europe, was to negotiate with the German authorities. Who would have thunk it? So they contacted the SS officers in charge of implementing the final solution in Hungary. And soon after that, Mr. Adolf Eichmann made his offer, blood for goods. A certain number of Jews would be spared in exchange for goods, including trucks. And Dr. Kastner negotiated with Eichmann and later with Kurt Bescher, a Nazi official. But he went beyond that. In late June of 1944, Dr. Kastner convinced Eichmann to release 1,700 Jews. And they drew up a list of these are the Jews you're going to save. There were wealthy Jews, there were Zionists, there were rabbis, and they were transported out of Hungary on what came to be known as the Kastner train. And after being, the good news is that after being detained in Bergen-Belsen camp, the members of that train eventually reached safety in Switzerland. Sometimes it works out. And those are examples of Shagra Wheel's beautiful paintings. I'd be remiss not to mention the righteous among nations. Those were the non-Jews who helped Jews by hiding Jewish victims in their home, on their property, providing false papers, smuggling and assisting Jews to escape, and most important, rescuing and caring for children who were left alone. They were either orphaned or they just became separated from their parents. And these are photos from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, Israel, where there are plaques honoring the righteous among nations, and there's a beautiful garden there as well. I want to go back to another quote from Elie Wiesel. He said, "And so we must know these good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them. And in gratitude and hope, we must remember them." I'd like to end this by asking what the takeaways from today's presentation is. Well, when thinking about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, you can't just dwell on how little or maybe ineffectual it might have appeared to have been, because if you do that, it just trivializes the historical record and it dishonors the memory of those who perished. Okay? So rather, given the circumstances, Jews and other targeted groups, like the Roma Gypsies, Afro-Europeans, other disabled people, non-Polish Jews, It was amazing that any act of defiance occurred at all. I think we can agree with that. So these acts of resistance demonstrate to us today the resolve of the Jewish people and their allies who triumphed against all odds. In every ghetto, in every deportation train, in every labor camp within the hidden forests, and even in the death camps. The will to resist was strong, and it took many forms. So we cannot say that the resistance of Jews made no impact when we believe, as Jews, that each life saved is a blessing, and in some cases, more than 1,000 of them were saved. Even passivity was a form of resistance. To die with dignity was a form of resistance. So I would ask you, dear beautiful students, that you think about what actions you would have taken if you lived in Nazi-occupied Europe. What role will you play today and in the future when faced with the decision to take action in the face of injustice and hate? In Hebrew, we use the term zachor, which means to remember. Why remember? Because there's no denying that a Hitler is alive today, waiting for us to forget. And learn from our tragedy. It's not a written law that the next victims are going to be Jews. It can be anybody. We saw it began in Germany with 6 million Jews, but 5 million non-Jews were also murdered by the psychotic ravings and evil ideologies of a madman. So you're going to be a bystander? You're going to be an upstander? It's up to you. There was another quote by Elie Wiesel that just came into my mind. To forget the people who were murdered is to kill them again. And I will leave you with that, and I thank you very much for attending. And have a good day, and shalom.